Good morning. My name is Ken Frankel. I'm President of Council for the Americas. And Martha Blackwell, who you all know, have spoken to at one point or another, planning of this conference, is floating around somewhere. There she is. And as you all know, she's the one responsible for the conference on. So she's the one. I'd first like to start out by recognizing two ambassadors who have been instrumental in making this hopefully a success, certainly getting it to this point, and were with us from the very beginning. Ambassador Martín Vidal from Uruguay, who's here now, and Ambassador Federico Hoyos, who will be joining us shortly from Colombia. Also like to recognize Rodrigo Garcia from Colombia, Eric Ponce from Mexico, Francesca Brivio from Peru, y Andrés Vázquez de Peru, all from the heads of their cannabis associations in their respective countries. Thank you for coming up, and thank you to everybody in the audience, particularly those who've come from far and wide to be here. My comments are very, very short because we want to get on with the program. We have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I just want to say the purpose of this conference is actually quite simple. And the purpose of it is to place Canada in the leadership of serious discussion about the issue of medicinal cannabis in the hemisphere, to create a space where regulators feel comfortable talking amongst themselves, hopefully periodically, hopefully at least on an annual basis at this very forum, and where they can also talk about to the public what's going on and what their thoughts are, again, in a serious, respectful kind of a way. That's the simple purpose of this conference, and that's what we hope gets perpetuated going forward. And all of you who are here today and others who will join us, we hope you join us in this effort to strengthen this purpose so Canada can be at the center of a discussion. We think it's a rightful place for Canada to be, not just in this topic, but it's also consistent with Canada's role in the world traditionally and currently. There's just one programming note. There's going to be a change in the second session. Mark Ware's plane is delayed. He's en route. So the second session will actually become the third session, and the third session will become the second session. So the second session now will be about the Caribbean regulators speaking. With that, I'd like to present our opening panel. Neither of them need an introduction. Their bios are in the program. Maria Katawi, we particularly thank you for coming here. Maria basically came in from Geneva for 18 hours, precisely just to be at this conference and support what we were doing. We thank you, and we thank the Commission for all your support in this. Amanda Lang, obviously everybody in this room knows Amanda very well, the leading business television personality, anchor, thought leader for business in Canada, and certainly one of the leading journalists, on-screen journalists in Canada on business. So, Maria, if I could invite you, please.
This podium is made for someone considerably taller than me. But anyway, I want to thank you, Mr. Frankel, particularly to the Canadian Council for the Americas for hosting this discussion. I think it's timely and very brave of you. I'd like to say also welcome to all the excellencies here, and regulators and business people from Canada, and from particularly the southern part of the American hemisphere. This is an incredible moment, I think, in our history. It's a moment of great interest in the world and in medical cannabis, because the industry is beginning just to take off around the world, and the ideas and people thinking about it. I'm a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and certainly later on we can, if you want any word on the brave folk who are part of it. Many of you from your countries know presidents from Mexico, former presidents, Mexico, Colombia, for instance, Latin America, Nigeria, Louise Arbour from Canada, many, many other very, very distinguished people. And we believe that future policies in the area need to be built, in any case, inclusively. Different stakeholders absolutely have to take an active part. There's no other way to find paths forward, not solutions, but paths forwards and directions for the many issues that are facing this new market. And I say this new market without quite defining it. I'll come to that. So I really want to thank you all for taking time, especially for the regulators from the Caribbean and Latin American countries. It is also a moment to exchange knowledge and experience, because we're at the early days in this area, and we need to include knowledge and experimentation, public health people, human rights people, people from markets, from trade, from citizens groups, those also interested in social justice. The reason I say this is I don't need to emphasize that for over 50 years, we've seen what I call a moralistic, ideological global war on drugs, a call for a drug-free world, which is absolutely nonsense. It has been advanced this through fierce law enforcement, and even we've seen militarization. I think it's absolutely necessary that we all realize that while you in this room understand this, not everybody does yet. And it has to be again and again acknowledged that it's been an utter failure, this war on drugs. And there's been a tremendous murderous harm to individuals and societies. It has only increased violence, and it has only increased criminal gains at the expense of some of the most poor and some of the most vulnerable in the world. Indeed, I think you also all remember the convention, the single convention on narcotic drugs, which was 1961, in force in 64, yes. They all agreed, the states, to eliminate cannabis from the world, I quote, in 25 years. And here we are, 55 years later. And thank goodness we're openly speaking about regulatory systems. My colleagues and I at the Global Commission were among the first global voices to call for an incremental yet decisive shift, a move away from the days in which drugs and drug taking was called, and I quote because that's in the UN wording, evil, to one that is based on research, evidence, experience, medical and scientific knowledge, with the absolute need to discuss with all stakeholders and not just states throughout our communities. You very well know, I come from Switzerland, and you very well know that the heroin-assisted treatment experience in Switzerland was only accomplished because of deep, ongoing, and many years of consultation with people. I mean, broad consultation daily on our media, with law enforcement, with the medical world, with civil society, with the poor, with the incarcerated, with the drug traders themselves. And in a conservative country like Switzerland, conservatives in the sense of socially calm, this country voted in heroin-assisted. That is the right for heroin addicts to get their heroin from a doctor, synthetic heroin. And that, long before cannabis was talked about. So this is the kind of consultation and work that we all need to engage in. The Global Commission, all of us, we hold that drugs, like many other potentially dangerous products and behaviors, I say potentially, requires states to take control of their markets and regulate their access, and not only in order to minimize any harms, but even more important, to maximize the benefits. We regulate car use, we regulate isotopes and medical use, we regulate chemicals that are used in our household products, very dangerous items. We regulate chemicals in our food. That could be done perhaps a little more. And I think we should absolutely be able to regulate the market of cannabis and benefit from the different uses of its different ingredients. just to frame things, the Global Commission, we go beyond cannabis. We call for all drugs to be regulated according to their dangerousness. As a group, through years of exchange and reading of scientific evidence, we have understood that the demand for drugs will not be obliterated. After more than 1/2 of a century of this fierce war on drugs, it has taken hundreds of thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, and the demand is there and it is growing. So we believe firmly that an incremental regulation is pivotal. Here are some of its elements. It needs to be realistic. It needs to address sound justice. It needs to be evaluated and assessed and continuously assessed in a multidisciplinary way. It needs to be discussed and debated and adapted in the public, because this is a new regulatory field for everyone, and we're all learning from each other and from its deployment. So, today, here, by starting with medical cannabis, citizens, regulators, governments, businesses can begin to build appropriate regulatory systems. There's no one kind, but start to build those systems for potentially other drugs as well. This is now a worldwide movement. The legal sale of cannabis is bringing experience and is opening discussions for an understanding of what options there are for further regulating other substances. As important, I think it could contribute to addressing also the lack of serious research on the different ingredients, for instance, of cannabis, and the lack of access to pain relief medication and treatment, where there is evidence of the effectiveness and cost-effectiveness of cannabis. It is imperative that scientific and market research is reinforced. Yet, as with every policy, we have to be attentive to the challenges, and this is the core, what I would like to leave with you for further discussion. The challenge of getting the regulatory framework right. And this includes, of course, the temptation of overcomplicated overregulation, or its contrary, too chaotic and unbalanced markets, the issue of taxation, costs, and unintended consequences of overpricing to cover costs, therefore perhaps corresponding lack of legal product available or a new black market. Or even, we see large companies today emerging and crowding out local producers internationally. Before concluding, one final point for consideration and discussion. Everyone here, we all face a difficulty in the international agreements, conventions, regimes, etc. in this field. One aspect has been addressed by the Global Commission recently. I don't know if you've seen their recent report. It's online. All the reports are online. And it is about the classification of psychoactive substances. The international classification system, it was put in place after World War II. And substances that were culturally, commercially, socially important to Western citizens, such as tobacco and alcohol, were left outside of consideration in the international drug control system, while substances that were used in mild forms in developing countries were sacrificed. According to the same international classification tables that you know are called schedules, cannabis is a substance that presents the highest level of potential as addictive potential, as well as presenting no therapeutic benefits. That's where we are today in the classification schedules. So your work on medical cannabis is actually somewhat outside of the current convention's obligations, unless your national programs are presented as scientific research pilots. But this international law is not based on science, and it's outdated. And we have more scientific literature to base decisions on today. Canada and this hemisphere towards the south are pioneering in this field. It may well be that your leadership could be crucially important to building an international consensus for change on these schedules. Thus, I want to conclude just by recognizing all of you and encouraging your work to forge ahead. You are policy and enterprise pioneers, and I think that this will be recognized globally in a few years. We have spent more than half a century on misguided policies, so let's spend just a few now, trying to get the new medical cannabis policies right so that we can move on to the other drugs, to cannabis in general, which would be to the benefit of all our citizens. You are the people leading in business. You're the people living in regulation. You are the people thinking through some of these issues. But I venture to say that none of us will get it right unless you share knowledge and discussion with many other legitimate and important stakeholders. People who use cannabis, who use other drugs, health workers, social workers, different medical specialists, parents of school children, law enforcement, and many others. I wish you all good luck, bon courage, but above all, success.
Thank you, Maria. I now invite you on stage with Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda.
One note I didn't mention at the beginning, at every seat there are
Prostitutes.
earphones. This conference is being interpreted in Spanish and English simultaneously for those of you who would like to avail yourselves of that service.
And with that in mind, welcome everyone. I'm going to engage Maria in conversation, but we'd like to include you as much as possible. Those of you who are, because there are some people who are using translation, do we want to use the microphone for questions? Ken?
Yeah, we can do that.
Well, I guess we'll see what the translators think about that. It's a relatively small room. You may be able to make yourself heard. I'll keep an eye on you if you have a question.
They prefer
okay.
either that or we can repeat the question.
Okay, I will repeat the question for the translators. But I will, as I say, keep an eye on the room and just put your hand up, and I will include you as soon as you would like. Not right now, but very soon. Maria, it's fascinating to think that the schedules are so, I want to say out of date, but really, as you say, behind the science.
Yeah.
Is there, are we now in a world, and how is the Commission thinking about the fact that different jurisdictions are getting around that? In other words, in Canada, we've simply ignored that fact, and we have the innovation and the science in many, many labs to prove it. Is that going to be the way that the schedule will just languish out there, kind of ignored? And
I think it's one of the most critical questions. Now, I was talking to some people outside, and I know this is being recorded, so I categorically deny that I'm asking you to enter into criminal activity. On the other hand, we're all outside the conventions when we do this. Now, some countries, including Switzerland, Uruguay, and others, have found different ways around it. What I said there, Amanda, and I think this is the moment, because in history we haven't had a moment like this, where so many countries are starting to get through, first starting with medical cannabis and then opening that as a wedge. That I'm hoping in this year, what I call a leap year, a gap year, you called it in America or something, a gap year, where the official bodies in the UN are not having a big meeting of some kind, and that great state consensus has to be done. I'm hoping that we can start to build up a large enough coterie, how do you say, large enough cadre, large enough group of countries, cities that are experimenting, that are working on this in such a way that flexibility and scientific evidence can start to be built in. Maybe, Amanda, as you said, for the first part of this, this is new since 1 year, actually, we're starting this experimentation. So I'm hoping that it will build and that it will become obvious that change has to take place. I would like to say that, but I am not going to go to the British betting houses on it.
when you talk about the war on drugs, of course, we all picture one man. It's a very American kind of sort of sensibility, I think, it's safe to say. I was intrigued at the lack of Americans on the Global Commission.
Oh, no, yes and no. Sorry to, the original Global Commission had Mr. Volcker, hard to be more distinguished,
Yes.
and George Shultz, but they are 90s something. They were brave. They were very brave people. And you're right. We need to reinforce that with some younger people already now understanding where America is going.
And the reason I ask
Yes.
it is the elephant in the room. I mean, in Canada, we feel it very strongly because in our community, in our investment community, travelers, we're very aware of the fact that we run afoul of federal law at our closest border. Is there a wedge that you see that begins with cannabis and may actually inform other
Yes.
psychotropics for the U.S. that would change the mentality around this in a meaningful way?
I think you're right, Amanda. There are several things on this. The first is there is already a movement of what I call diversion on, as you all know, on incarceration. Over-incarceration is one of the major problems. It's expensive, it's ridiculous, and it costs human lives. The social cost is far greater than any economic cost. So diversion on decriminalization, de facto decriminalization in many countries has also taken place. Mm-hmm. And the fact, I have a list here, this number of countries this year thinking of changing drastically many of their laws, from Mexico, New Zealand, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Jamaica, Israel, South Africa. Of course, Switzerland is taking things to the THC level now from the original, yes. Portugal, Georgia, France, the list goes on. These are people seriously thinking of changing. So yes, the states in the US and all this will all be submerged by this movement. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's important where we're here, is to see how we can get a hold on it so that it is not, shall we say, manipulated incorrectly.
The place that does seem to be, and that the relevance of this conference is noted, is medicinal cannabis seems to be the place, the entry point for many countries. Yes. Canada's gone the next step,
yes,
of course, and allowed recreational, yes, but we're an outlier. Is that the right, from the Commission's point of view, is the medicinal side, science-driven, health and welfare, is that the right way to go? Could you carry that over to other classes of drugs, for instance, and say, get them in the lab and see what the medical benefits are?
It could be. We have not pronounced on this in the Global Commission. The Global Commission sees, because it looks at it in a larger way, it sees medical cannabis as a very good wedge. But actually, the arc of what we see is that we start with harm reduction, even when all the laws are there. We move on into the responsibility of the medical community, which is what Switzerland did, in order to work out the prevention, the medical care, long before cannabis, on the most vulnerable, the most needy. From there, decriminalization, not necessarily legalization, but decriminalization, then a slow path towards regulation. And I think most countries have gone through that arc. And even some of the really recalcitrant countries have started harm reduction. When we come to this upper end, I'm not sure that there's any one path. Medical cannabis has come in the last 18 months, and no more than 18 months, as being one of the best ways in to this issue. It's certainly in my country, in Switzerland, we started that way, and this year they're going to open up from CBD to THC. But this is some of the ways in which people are finding a path. I do not say that I think that it's the only path.
The different challenges for different countries, and you can imagine that, for instance, the regulatory and policy environment of Colombia would be very different than Switzerland.
Right. Yes, it is.
When we think about harm reduction, and it's interesting in the Canadian context, because one of the public policy or social goods that we envision is that you take this trade out of the hands of criminals. Mm-hmm. You regulate it, you monitor it. it hasn't necessarily happened in Canada. The black market is thriving at this moment, partly because governments are slow and expensive. So maybe we'll get there. But if you're talking about, do we have evidence that in a place where the production and sale of currently illegal drugs are firmly in the hands of cartels or criminal organizations, do we have evidence that that would change? Or would they simply then be in traffic in a legal product?
So this is where the words that I mentioned earlier, I think, are the most important. It's hard to regulate a market. Doesn't matter what market it is, and especially a new one where you don't have tens, if not centuries of experience. Just, by the way, look at the agricultural market in Europe, and you can see how hard it is to regulate a market. So one of the difficulties is either over-costing, over-pricing, over-regulating, over-taxing, which means that, one, the product is not going to be available. And that has happened in some states. I think in California recently, I read that it had happened. And if the illegal market is undercutting that price, obviously it's going to flourish. That's the way markets work. So this is one of the challenges. We've seen in Portugal, by the way, where there's been decriminalization, not regulation. I was just down there with the Global Commission, talking with the government. And in Mexico, we were there at the change of the government to talk with them as well. Former President Zedillo and others have been very active in this to try and work out how that would happen, how you would make it happen to take the business away from the criminals, so to speak. Exactly what you said, Amanda. We've seen it to some extent in Switzerland. The decrease, by the way, in Switzerland, if you look at the statistics of even in heroin, it's just been absolutely gigantic. Because it's not only that heroin is available, but also because of the 4 pillars that they put in place, the most important one being education, prevention, knowledge, discussion, social support. These pillars all come together, and repression of the illegal market. It is definitely necessary also, as it is in alcohol or any other substance that's regulated. So I'm afraid that I'm being very difficult to say there's not one way to do this, but as anything, if it was simple, it would have been done a long time ago. It isn't. And regulators know this, and they know that whole context. That also means that business has to be a partner, and so do our citizens groups. Education, citizens work, social work, it isn't inexpensive to do. And it is, in fact, it is very expensive to do regulation right. But I just ask, think of the trillions of dollars that have gone illegally into the criminal world on this. Just think of the millions, if not tens of millions of lives that have been lost. And this is ridiculous that we can't manage to do something about it.
Do we have any questions in the room? So you mentioned that the move, beginning with CBD in some markets, moving to THC. Is there something kind of wrong-headed about that? In other words, in splitting this plant in two and saying we're okay with this part and not that part?
It's a very good question. Sometimes people start with depenalizing, not decriminalizing, but depenalizing. In other words, de facto, people move from one kind of part of cannabis to another. Okay, we overlook it. So there's been this sort of depenalization rather than full decriminalization. You know, you're the experts, certainly not me on this, but I understand that the research on cannabis itself, which is a complex plant, full of interesting varieties and lots of things we don't know about, is just now coming into a full research capacity. So I have nothing to say other than let's go ahead and find out. Let's do it. It's one plant with many varieties of things that can be done. I wouldn't speak on it until the whole story is out there and people have realized what its benefits certainly can be. And its pleasures, by the way.
You know, it was interesting to think back to when the schedules were written and those two culturally important drugs of alcohol and tobacco. And I think the science would say alcohol is actually one of the most pernicious drugs in the world. you know, and we think of the health, the understanding of the science of tobacco at the time. You know, women were given it when they were pregnant for nausea. You're told to have it if you were stressed. We now understand that is wrongheaded. There's a concern in places like Canada where we've gone the full bore. They're still in the lab. We're still figuring out the potential benefits of this marvelous thing. Are we doing enough to actually look at the harm? That there may be harm in consumption here. Are we doing enough on that side of the equation in our rush to legalize?
So I really, Amanda, I can't speak for Canada. I can speak what we've been doing in Switzerland. They've been going at it slowly. That is, until even now, with only CBD, 1% of THC, that's fine. They're slowly realizing that this is a complicated plant, and so it's not just those two ingredients that count. There are a lot of other things involved. Is there anything of human behavior that does not go to excess? Have we ever lived the golden mean? No. I fully expect that anything we do goes to excess, and that's what the regulatory job is to try and give some parameters. Yes, I'm sure that things will go to an excess. We all do. We like cars. The first thing we want is go faster, and then we have to regulate its speed. From the time when there used to be a runner in front of the car with a bell to warn people that there was an automobile coming down the line, to what we have today. So yes, we will, I'm sure, not get it always right, and I'm sure that we will always need to have some kind of control.
One of the things that makes the market so interesting as it's evolving is that the regulatory jurisdictions remain as different as the countries, you know, in which they operate. But the underpinning of this market is the capital markets,
yes,
which is it does flow across borders. So, could you envision, if you in a perfect world, would you envision a more homogeneous regulatory market for this product? Could that ever exist?
I haven't seen it in anything, Amanda. In all of our international trade agreements, this is my area of
We don't even
work.
have it for cheese, right? So
I don't see it anywhere.
Yeah.
In any product, I don't. But maybe in this one there are a few pitfalls that we might be concerned about. And Canada, while we're here in Canada. There are many, when a market is regulated, the production side is also part of it, not just the marketing and distribution side, but also the production. So some people argue that regulation should take into account the production. I think Canada's, what I read of Canada is it does not. But it should take into account the production, where it is, where it's sourced. This is an international trade issue. And I see worldwide now that there is a little bit of concern. There are a few a few countries with small farmers in this field. I take Colombia as an example, where it's been really important in the peace negotiations that these people are protected and not under threat by anything, either eradication or any political groups trying to take them over. But they are vulnerable to businesses taking them over, to large businesses taking them over. And so I understand is possible in Jamaica, even in European countries. We're beginning to worry about the production side and making sure that the competition and the small grower is not crowded out and does not become a monopolized, cartelized by business market. Yes.
And there are interesting kind of competing issues there, right, on quality control.
Yes. Versus
maintaining the sort of more, I don't know, the way of life, the farming aspect of it. How, do you have thoughts about how you regulate that?
Amanda, you're the one who knows the business world best, and I think you've seen this in trade issues. You've seen this, for instance, in famous past rounds where intellectual property comes in, where small producers of generic drugs needed to be helped and protected. So I don't think there's going to be anything different. Maybe one could envisage, it isn't very popular today to make multilateral trade treaties. Well, this would be one gigantic fun, wouldn't it, just to consider that there would be an agreement in some way in this one that would protect farmers' IP and so forth. I think I'm dreaming here, but it would be a fun one. They can't get the cars right, they can't get the tariffs right. Maybe they can do this one.
Do we have any questions out here? Yes, sir?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner, for a great conversation. Very informative. My question relates to the speed in which regulation's coming. And we've seen in some places the Supreme Court weighs in to individual rights. And just want to get your thoughts as to if time progresses too long, whether or not the courts will play a bigger role.
That is a very challenging concept. So we're talking, on one side, we're talking about a possible international regime. Courts will come in the beginning probably only, of course, nationally or even very locally even. What they could come in on is a question. I'm hesitating because you're beginning an area which I often myself hesitate to say. And this is the individual human right to take a substance. But that's what we're talking about at the base of it. We've been trying to take out the morality of it, that drugs are evil, to put it on first a more of a medical basis, but underlying all of that is more and more of a concept that it is the right of citizens to take a drink, even have a cigarette, knowing exactly what it does. Take maybe 2 drinks, which you cannot drive afterwards, so you have limits on what you can do. Take drugs that are regulated. Would the courts weigh in on that? Possibly. But if at least in our countries, if they've gone through legislative and other processes, and if the movement has grown up from the ground with solid bases on it, I think that any court possibility of intervention might be more technical than substantive. But that means that we have to get across to citizens that we're not talking here of some kind of new high-tech product. We're talking here of something quite different, which is the right of citizens to take drugs knowing that some 80, according to the World Health Organization, some 80% of people or more who do not never create any kind of difficulty, health-wise or dependency. So nevertheless, these are difficult substances. So where a court could come in, that is, I'm not quite sure whether it's on the technical side of things or whether it's on the underlying right of citizens. That I'm not sure of.
Any other questions? Yes?
I'd like to know Ms. Katawi, sorry. Hi, good morning. I would like to know Ms. Katawi's opinion about the report of recommendation of the World Health Organization right now being, or just being discussed in Vienna at the CND.
On what aspect, please?
About cannabis and the the list of CBD in the CBD or cannabis in general in the scale of country.
I've said that I think we need to have more and more citizens groups, other kinds of groups, whether it's labor groups or legal groups, doesn't matter who, lots of people, including associations such as this, lots of them, start to question these things in the UN, in international instances. It's the only way. You can only break through, we can only break through this by a mass understanding that all the past has been fairly ridiculous, not having alcohol at the very top and having cannabis instead as the most dangerous drug. Cannabis is the most dangerous. So yes, we need all of us to do it. I can't comment on the details of what they're saying because I don't know. But I do know that this is necessary. So if we can move, our medical profession sometimes is among the least interested in doing this, by the way, of stirring up trouble. So we need to get them on board too.
Yes, sir. Any other questions? No? Yes?
Amazing presentation thus far, and learned lots. Something that is, I think, of utmost importance is the bankability of the industry, especially in the Caribbean and Latin America when it comes to correspondent banking. Wanted to get your thoughts on how European banks and the banking system can help to mitigate or that headwind when it comes to correspondent banking. What are your thoughts?
You've now opened a subject I think that Amanda and I both could go on to for hours, and that is the hegemony of the international banking system. You know as well as I do that there are many ideas out there, particularly in Europe, to make sure that the international banking system can be protected for the exchange of banks, the SWIFT system, BIC, whatever you call it, wherever you are, from the fact that it can be closed down by the United States at any time. You know very well that interstate banking for cannabis sales in the US, because it's not federal, cannot happen. So only, I think it was 2 months ago, that the state banking system allowed money to be banked. Otherwise, you had to keep it, in ingots under your bed kind of thing. In Europe, it doesn't so much pose itself because it's within the country that this has been going, not internationally so much. It's a very good question you raise. The international system is now dominated by the SWIFT system, which was set up by the US and can be closed down, and people can be shut out of it at any time when any sanction is on. This is a problem with every country, as you know, right now. So I can't tell you anything more than that I know that other groups, not just Europe, but other ones, including the Chinese, are thinking of setting up other financial flow systems for banking. Individually, inside of a country like mine, for instance, the internal banking system can take care of this. Internationally, not so much. Not so much. So it does pose a problem. With US could, and interestingly, it hasn't. So that's a question to Amanda of why it hasn't so far.
Good question for Paul Volcker. I want to ask you this. It's a theoretical question because in Canada, of course, we've gone. You said that the regulatory pace could either be slow, burdensome, I'm putting words in your mouth, or chaotic.
No, I said the regulatory system has a temptation to go the two ways.
Yes.
One, over-regulating, over-costing, over-making it complicated. Or the other one, just let it happen.
Which you could argue is what Canada did. We legalized. My theoretical question for you is, because the genie's out of the bottle in Canada, would the path to common agreement on this substance at least have been clearer if we all stuck with medical cannabis? In other words, if it was lab-driven, science-driven, not recreational. Did the recreational aspect of this, when we think of the US and the bankability, did that muddy the waters in a way that makes it difficult?
It's a very good question because we do have international conventions on opioids, on the production and the integrity. You know, there's perfectly legal opioids that are needed by medicine for pain relief. We have, in fact, not enough. By the way, that's another story. Well, in Afghanistan have said for years, why don't they just buy the entire poppy field? They certainly can't grow high value crops in this scrubland. So if the government bought it, made it legally, sold it legally, that would maybe take it out of the hands of the Taliban and others. But never mind, that's just a side thing. We do have an example of that because the legal opioid market is there, it exists, and that's the way countries buy their medicines. They're supposed to be made correctly. Mm-hmm. So can we do it in this? I don't know. I don't think we should. I think the cat is out of the bag on this. and that medical cannabis and cannabis in all its forms is kind of being melded together in many, many countries. So I would say it's better perhaps to try and find a new kind of way to do it rather than trying to force it into the strictures of past examples. What do you think?
I think you know more about it than I do.
No. No, it's a business proposition too, you know.
It's an interesting one, and I will say I'm getting flagged that we're at time, so I'd like to say that to begin this day, I could think of nobody better than you with the global lens that you have on this subject and the depth of your knowledge of it. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Amanda.
Please join me in
leading us.
thanking Maria Katawi.
Thank you all, and bon courage to continue.